All right, let's just jump right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly deeply complex report called The Architecture of Erasure. We hear the phrase community standards all the time online, right? It sounds great. It implies this shared democratic baseline of safety, something engineered to protect us from abuse or exploitation in the digital public square. But what happens when those exact same protective algorithms actually become tools for systemic silencing? Today, we are exploring essential mystery: how seemingly neutral digital governance quietly shapes the reality we see online. And we're going to look at this through the lens of one of society's most sensitive topics, the institution of adoption.
To understand what's truly at stake here, I want you to picture this. Imagine waking up and finding your entire support network, a safe space you literally rely on every single day, just abruptly wiped out by an algorithm. Gone. Well, that is exactly what happened in this instance. An adoptee advocate had to frantically message his network because their Facebook group, Adoption Facing Realities, was suddenly suspended for violating community standards. They were left scrambling, trying to appeal and migrate thousands of members to a backup group before losing touch completely.
Which leads us to a pretty massive, provocative question. Why on earth would an adoption support group violate community standards? Well, the source report presents a really compelling thesis. It argues that automated moderation systems are inadvertently suppressing the voices of marginalized adult adoptees, all to protect established institutional power. Basically, when individuals share their lived experiences of trauma, coercion, or identity loss, they end up running headfirst into these digital walls that are designed to keep dominant, culturally accepted narratives perfectly intact.
So moving into Section 1, the business of adoption. To grasp why these specific narratives are so heavily policed, the report tells us we really have to look at what's at stake when the traditional narrative is challenged. Get this. The adoption industry in the United States alone generates an estimated $1.4 billion every single year. Let that sink in. It's a massive economic engine, and like any billion-dollar industry, it relies heavily on a specific public relations narrative. We're talking a narrative of rescue, permanence, and altruism. Keeping that image pristine is absolutely crucial to maintain its economic equilibrium and ensure a steady pipeline of prospective parents.
Historically, the story builds from what's known as the baby scoop era, spanning from 1945 to 1973. During that time, an estimated 4 million mothers faced immense, systemic coercion to surrender their infants, and their trauma was largely ignored. Now fast forward to the digital age, and we see the rise of unlicensed online baby brokers. These are basically unregulated digital entities using predatory advertising, charging prospective parents matchmaker fees of up to $35,000. It got so out of hand that in 2024, the FTC actually stepped in and issued 31 warning letters to these intermediaries. So we're looking at a space with incredibly high financial stakes and just fierce competition over online real estate.
All right, Section 2, algorithms versus honest language. How does this highly lucrative economic machine use language to maintain its sanitized image? And how do algorithms actually enforce it? So the industry mandates what it calls respectful adoption language, or RAL. This framework was designed to basically soothe insecurities and frame adoption purely as a mutually beneficial choice. Think of terms like birth mother or placed for adoption. But in stark contrast, adoptee advocates developed honest adoption language, or HAL. They use words like natural mother, taken, or stolen to accurately describe their lived, sometimes very traumatic realities. The report points out that the industry aggressively promotes RAL as the only acceptable, quote-unquote, civil way to speak. And here is exactly how that linguistic clash triggers an absolute moderation catastrophe. Let's say an adult adoptee writes a post critically analyzing their own past. Maybe they state they feel their adoption involved fraudulent documents and they were stolen. Well, the platform's natural language processing AI spots those high-risk keywords. But because the AI lacks any sense of human nuance, it's a machine, right? It doesn't see a survivor processing historical trauma. It blindly assumes it has uncovered imminent criminal coordination. Boom, it triggers a human exploitation flag and instantly deletes the post. The precise language adoptees need to describe their reality is the exact vocabulary the machine is trained to ruthlessly eradicate. Which brings us to Section 3, defining online harm. If the machine is just blindly enforcing these rules, we really have to peel back the next layer and ask, who actually gets to define what language is dangerous in the first place? The report introduces a really powerful concept here called institutional capture. This basically happens when the advisory boards helping to set the rules are heavily dominated by the exact industries they are supposed to be analyzing. As the source explains, tech platforms don't just create safety standards out of thin air, they rely on external experts. And this reliance creates an inescapable environment of algorithmic coercion for any user whose experiences happen to conflict with those experts' views. Take tech giants like Meta, for example. They maintain extensive safety advisory councils. But who actually sits at the table for child welfare? Very often, it's massive lobbying groups like the National Council for Adoption, which, by the way, was founded explicitly to promote the expansion of the industry. The report demonstrates that when critical adoptee discourse emerges, say advocating for birth records or discussing coercion, these institutional partners often frame it not as a civil rights discussion, but as a direct threat to child welfare or a form of online harassment. Seeking to minimize their own corporate risk, the platforms just adopt this framing. Ultimately, the report argues, this leads platforms to essentially pathologize adoptee dissent.
Moving to Section 4, the global regulatory net. Let's zoom out for a second, because we're not just talking about a domestic corporate policy issue here. This is scaling up into massive, sweeping international laws. This global regulatory net is vast, and it is highly restrictive. Over in the European Union, the Digital Services Act threatens tech platforms with massive fines. We're talking up to 6% of their global turnover if they fail to swiftly remove illegal content. It also creates priority trusted flaggers, often NGOs, whose reports must be fast-tracked. Meanwhile, you have countries like Indonesia implementing strict social media bans, requiring the deletion of accounts for children under 16 by 2026. Now, these regulations are incredibly well-intentioned, right? They're designed to stop horrific abuses. But the report highlights that they force platforms into extreme risk aversion. If an adoptee from the Global South posts about their illegal adoption to expose historical wrongs, the platform might simply delete it to satisfy an EU mandate. It ends up catching the marginalized victim in the exact same net designed for criminals. And this brilliantly illustrates a tragic irony found in the source material. By mandating total parental consent and digital age gating, the state essentially hands absolute gatekeeping power directly to adoptive parents. If those parents wish to suppress a child's connection to their biological culture, well, the law gives them the tools to do so permanently. For vulnerable youth, as the report so poignantly notes, the legal protection of the child becomes functionally indistinguishable from the total isolation of the child.
Which leads us to Section 5, the architecture of exile. So what happens to these displaced communities when they face this kind of profound human cost? Well, adoptee activists are migrating to alternative platforms, places like Substack and Discord. But the report urges us not to view this as just some trendy creator economy pivot. It is an eviction. Moving to subscription-based platforms introduces what the source calls a structural ransom. Marginalized individuals literally have to pay, or ask their often traumatized audiences to pay, just to access a digital space where an algorithm won't silence what they view as their truth. It's a heavy financial tax required simply to speak openly. And sadly, it ultimately silos these vital voices away from the mainstream public.
So we have covered a ton of ground today, tracing this journey all the way from the multi-billion-dollar economics of adoption to the incredibly blunt instruments of global AI moderation. The report makes it abundantly clear that community standards, at least in their current form, often codify the ideological status quo rather than objective moral safety. So I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. When an algorithm is trained to filter out historical realities in the name of civility, who actually benefits when a machine decides what is safe to say? It really makes you rethink the hidden forces shaping our digital world, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the architecture of the platforms you use every single day.